There's a moment, and I think everyone who's ever stood at the edge of something impossible knows exactly what I mean. There's a moment right before everything changes where the world goes very, very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the kind of quiet you get when you're sitting by a lake somewhere watching the sun come down slow and easy. I mean the other kind, the held breath kind, the kind where your body knows something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. I've been chasing that feeling my whole career. My name is Archivist Velsoren Toth. I worked, I suppose, past tense now feels more accurate for the Imperial Bureau of Historical Continuity, which is a title that sounds much more important than it actually is. Most of what I did for 32 cycles of my life was sit in a very small office on the administrative ring of Station Kethamara and read old documents. I cataloged them. I cross-referenced them. I filed reports about them that other people mostly never read. I was, in every measurable sense, a minor person, a footnote keeper. And then I found the humans. Let me explain something about the Empire before I go any further, because if you're reading this without that context, none of what comes after will make any sense. The Galactic Empire, the one we're talking about, the Vethkari Empire, which has been the dominant governmental structure in the inner 7 sectors for approximately 4,000 years, did not arrive at its current state through kindness. That's not a criticism, it's just a fact. Empires are built through force and maintained through agreement, and the Vethkari were very good at both. By the time I was born, the empire spanned 43 inhabited systems. 43. With something like 11 distinct sapient species living under the same administrative roof, paying the same taxes, using the same currency, and arguing in the same legislative chambers. It was enormous and complicated, and most of the time it worked. But the thing about empires is that they have edges, and edges are expensive to maintain. The outer sectors, the ones that the interior politicians called the fringe, with a very specific kind of dismissal in their voices, those sectors had always been contested. Different factions, different warlords, different independent systems that weren't quite powerful enough to threaten the empire directly, but were absolutely powerful enough to make life difficult for anyone living out there. The Kethamara station, where I worked, sat right on the border of what most interior citizens called civilization, which meant that every few months, something would happen out in the fringe that would send worried dispatches through the relay network, and someone in a high office would convene an emergency session, and then someone slightly lower would write a very alarming memo. And eventually, that memo would trickle down to my desk in some form that required me to locate historical precedents for whatever was currently going wrong. I was good at finding those precedents, but I had never, in 32 cycles, found anything quite like what I found in the sealed archive on the morning that this story really begins. I should tell you about the sealed archive. Every major station has one. It's not a secret, everyone knows they exist, but they're not exactly advertised either. The sealed archive is where you put documents that are either too sensitive, too politically inconvenient, or too confusing to put in the general collection. Things that don't fit neatly into the existing historical narrative. Things that contradict the official record just enough to be uncomfortable. Most of the time, the stuff in the sealed archive is mundane in a different way than the regular archive. Instead of being boring, it's embarrassing. Old records of treaties that fell apart. Evidence of agreements that the empire made and then quietly ignored. Memos from officials who turned out later to be deeply corrupt. You get access to it after 15 cycles of service. It's one of the few actual perks of the job. I'd been working through the sealed archive's oldest records for about 8 months when I found the file cluster designated XH7. The designation itself should have told me something. Our filing system used letters from the Vethkari primary alphabet for sector designations. X wasn't a letter in that alphabet. X was used for one thing only, non-imperial species. Species that existed outside the Empire's formal taxonomy. Species that were, for one reason or another, outside the normal record. And the 7? 7 was the designation the old pre-imperial catalogers had used for species they couldn't classify. Not because the species were primitive or dangerous or unimportant, but because the species didn't fit the categories the catalogers were using. XH7 meant unclassified non-imperial species, subtype H. Subtype H, as far as I had ever known, was empty, a placeholder for something that had never been filled in. Except it very much had. The file cluster was enormous, thousands of documents. Some of them were so old that the encoding format required a translation protocol I had to request special access to use. When I finally got it working and started reading, I sat there for 3 hours without moving. Then I went and made myself something warm to drink, came back, and read for another 4 hours. Then I called my supervisor and told her I needed an emergency appointment. She thought someone had died. In a way, I suppose she was right, because what I had found in subtype H was a species that the Empire had decided, approximately 600 years ago, to declare officially extinct. They weren't extinct. They were humans. The history of humanity and the Empire is not something they teach in schools. I want to be very clear about that, because when this all became public, and it did eventually become public, in ways I'll get to, there were a lot of people saying they had known all along, that it was obvious that, of course, humans had played some significant role in early imperial history. Those people were lying, or they were misremembering in a very convenient direction. The truth was that humans weren't even a rumor by the time I found that file cluster. They were less than a rumor. They were the kind of thing that existed in old sailors' stories and low-quality entertainment serials, the sort of content that serious people dismissed with a specific kind of contemptuous smile. There's a phrase in Vethkari common speech. It roughly translates to human tale, and it means something that is obviously invented, probably emotionally manipulative, and almost certainly wrong. Like telling a child's story to an adult. You'd say someone was spinning human tales when you thought they were exaggerating for effect. That's how thoroughly the memory had been erased. The species itself had been reduced to a metaphor for fiction. And yet here were the documents, the real ones, the ones that had been sealed and cross-indexed and buried in a subsystem that hadn't been actively accessed in over 200 years. The first thing that struck me, reading through those files, was the dates. Humans had made contact with the early Vethkari Confederation, the political structure that eventually became the Empire approximately 1400 years ago. Not as subjects, not as a conquered people. They had made contact as potential allies. The early Confederation was in serious trouble at that point. I knew the broad outlines of that period from standard imperial history, the consolidation wars, the conflicts with the Dravathi Collective, the economic instability of the outer expansion. What I had not known, what the standard record very carefully did not mention, was that the Confederation had been losing. Losing badly. The Dravathi Collective at that point controlled more territory, had a larger fleet, and had a military doctrine that was proving extraordinarily effective against Confederation defense patterns. Their assault on the inner systems was advancing at a rate that the Confederation's own strategic models suggested was unsurvivable. Within 40 years, according to those models, the Confederation would have been either absorbed or destroyed. That was the world into which humanity arrived. The first contact logs were fascinating and strange, and not at all what I expected. The Confederation's initial assessment of humans was, and I say this with all the professional objectivity I can muster, not flattering. The physical description in the contact logs was clinical and somewhat baffled. The humans were soft-bodied, warm-blooded, bilaterally symmetrical, with an unusual number of sensory organs clustered around a single head structure. They were bipedal. They communicated through a system of spoken and written language. They came from a single planet in a small solar system at the outer edge of a spiral arm that the Confederation had barely bothered to map. They were, by every metric the Confederation used to assess military value, unremarkable. Average size. Average intelligence as far as any test could determine. No exotic biological features. No unusual physical capabilities. No existing alliance network, no significant fleet, no established political structure that spanned more than their own immediate stellar neighborhood. The assessment concluded, and I am reading this directly because I want the language to land correctly, that the H-variant species presents no strategic value of note and warrants only minimal diplomatic engagement. Minimal diplomatic engagement. That was the official position of the Confederation, 1400 years ago, regarding the species that was about to save it. I need to tell you about Commander Ilara Voss. She's the one who changes everything, not because she was trying to. In fact, from everything in the historical record, it seems like she spent most of her life trying to stay as far out of the spotlight as possible. She was career military. Human military, which at that point was a relatively small interstellar force. About 200 ships, a handful of stations. Most of their military doctrine focused on things like piracy suppression and local system defense. She's in the record for the first time as the captain of a single vessel, a mid-sized ship called the CSN Reliance. The CSN stood for Coalition of Settled Neighborhoods, which was the human political structure at the time, a loose agreement among their various colonies to cooperate on certain things, defense being one of them. Commander Voss was 41 years old when she showed up in the Confederation sector. She had been dispatched on an exploration and diplomatic outreach mission. The humans had apparently picked up fragments of Confederation communications and had decided, somewhat independently, and with perhaps more confidence than the situation warranted, that it might be a good idea to introduce themselves. The Confederation officer who first received her transmission was a fleet admiral named Kesharova. I found his personal logs in the file cluster. He described the initial contact as tedious and the human ship as barely functional by any useful standard. He noted that he had assigned a junior diplomatic officer to handle the humans and had gone back to the more pressing business of figuring out how to stop the Drevathi from advancing through the Veth sector. The junior diplomatic officer was a young Vethkari named Oranthes. He was 24 years old, freshly posted, and apparently terrified of his new assignment. He's in the record because he kept meticulous notes. Everything he observed about the humans went into his log, their physical appearance, their communication patterns, their eating habits, their social structures, the way they laughed at things that he didn't find funny at all. He was the first person to notice that something about the humans was different. Not the obvious things, not their biology or their technology, something else. He wrote about it in his log in a way that I found deeply moving, reading it 600 years later. He wrote, "The H-variant officers I have met today are not remarkable in any individual sense. They are no larger, no stronger, no faster than myself. Their equipment is functional but not exceptional. Their political structure is small and by most reasonable measures insignificant. And yet there is something in the way they speak about difficult situations that I cannot quite identify. It is not bravado. It is not ignorance of danger." When I described the Drevathi advance to Commander Voss, she understood what I was saying. She understood the numbers. She was quiet for a long time, and then she asked if she could see the tactical maps. Not the summary. The actual maps, all of them. She has been in that room for 6 hours now. I checked on her twice. Both times she waved me away without looking up. He added at the bottom of the entry, almost as an afterthought, "I do not know what she is doing. I'm not sure I understand what kind of mind approaches a problem like that." What Commander Ilara Voss was doing for those 6 hours was something that the Confederation's entire strategic division had apparently failed to do in 3 years of losing the war. She was looking at the Drevathi assault patterns not as a military problem, but as a logistics problem. The distinction sounds small. It isn't. Military thinking, at least at that time in the Confederation, was focused on force matching. The Drevathi have X ships, we need X plus something ships to stop them. The Drevathi have this weapon, we need a better weapon. It was fundamentally a matching exercise, which made sense because that's how warfare had worked in that region of space for centuries. Humans, apparently, had a different tradition. Voss, looking at those tactical maps, saw something that 6 years of Confederation strategic analysis had missed. The Drevathi logistics chain was brittle. Their advance was extraordinary, fast, coordinated, disciplined, but it was also almost entirely dependent on a very small number of supply lines running back through a single corridor of space. The advance worked because it had momentum. If you stopped that momentum, if you could force the Drevathi fleet to sustain its position rather than continue moving, the supply chain would become critically overextended within approximately 4 months. They didn't need to fight the Drevathi fleet head-on. They needed to make the Drevathi fleet stop. Voss wrote up her analysis in 6 hours. She presented it to Oranthes. He sent it to his supervisor. It sat on that supervisor's desk for 3 days before anyone read it. When Fleet Admiral Kesharova finally saw it, his response, which is in the record because everything went into the file cluster, was, "Have someone explain this to me." That someone was Voss. The meeting lasted 8 hours. By the end of it, Kesharova had authorized a full strategic review. Within a week, the Confederation's War Council had reviewed the analysis. Within 3 weeks, they had a new plan. It was called, in the official record, the Veth Defensive Doctrine. Ilera Voss's name was not in that title. I noticed that. I noticed it very much. The plan worked. I want to say that simply because it gets lost sometimes in the detail of everything that comes after. The plan worked. The Confederation forces implemented a series of defensive operations that held the Dravathi advance in place for just long enough. The supply chain stretched. The Dravathi fleet began pulling back to resecure its logistics, and in that pulling back, the Confederation found the opening it needed. The war, which had seemed on the verge of ending in Confederation defeat, turned around in the space of about 14 months. But here's what the standard history records, and here's what it leaves out. What it records: the Veth Defensive Doctrine, the strategic genius of Fleet Admiral Kesharova, the heroism of the Confederation fleet, the eventual peace agreement, the transition from Confederation to Empire. What it leaves out: the humans. Because the humans weren't just advisors, they fought. Commander Voss had come to the Confederation on a diplomatic mission, but she had come in a warship with a full crew. And when the strategic plan was implemented, when the Confederation needed ships to hold certain positions while the new doctrine was put in place, the CSN reliance was there. The records of the actual combat are hard to read. Not because they're graphic, though some of them are, but because they're written in a way that suggests the Confederation officers documenting them were genuinely confused about what they were witnessing. One report from a Confederation squadron commander observing a holding action at a place called the Veth 4 Relay Point reads, "The H-variant vessel has sustained significant damage to its port propulsion system. It has not disengaged. I have transmitted retreat orders to all vessels in the holding perimeter. The H-variant vessel has acknowledged receipt of the order and has remained in position. I have transmitted the order again. The vessel has again acknowledged and remained in position." The crew appears to be directing their fire at incoming Dravathi vessels while simultaneously conducting what appear to be emergency repairs under active fire. I am not sure how to record this in standard format. The H-variant vessel is doing something I do not have a category for. Something I do not have a category for. That phrase appears in various forms in something like 40 separate documents in the XH7 file cluster. 40 times, across multiple species, multiple observers, multiple situations, someone in a position of authority watched humans do something and had to write down that they didn't know how to classify it. The human fleet by the end of the conflict had grown, not because the Confederation asked for more ships, they hadn't, not at first. But word got back to the human coalition that their people were out there, and that it mattered, and more ships came. 18 ships by the end. 18 vessels from a species that had been assessed as having no strategic value of note. The casualty figures are in the file cluster. I'm not going to list them all because this isn't that kind of document, but I want to say this. The human casualty rate, proportionally, was higher than any other species in the coalition that eventually formed to push the Dravathi back, and they kept coming anyway. There's a moment in the records, a specific moment, that I have thought about more than any other piece of this history. It's in a communication log from Commander Voss to Fleet Admiral Kesharova. It was sent after the battle at the relay point, after the Reliance had been pulled back for emergency repairs, after Voss had spent 2 days in a medical bay with injuries to her arm and her chest. It's a very short message. It reads, "I understand we will be needed again at the forward line when repairs are complete. I want you to know that my crew has been made aware of what is expected and has agreed unanimously. I am not reporting this because I want recognition. I am reporting it because I thought you should know that the decision was theirs, not mine." Fleet Admiral Kesharova's response was also short. He wrote, "I did not know that was a decision that could be made that way." The war ended, the Confederation became the Empire. And then, somewhere in the transition, in the political reshuffling and the treaty writing and the new power structures being assembled, something happened to the humans. I spent months in that file cluster trying to understand exactly what happened, and I'm not sure I ever got the full picture. The record gets deliberately thin in certain places, in ways that I now recognize as intentional. Someone, at some point, decided to clean up the history. What I can piece together: the human coalition after the war expected some kind of formal recognition, some kind of place in the new order that was being built. They had fought. They had contributed strategic thinking that had arguably saved the Confederation. They had died in numbers that, proportionally, exceeded every other allied species. They expected to matter. What they got instead was a very politely worded series of diplomatic communiques that expressed gratitude in general terms, outlined the terms of a limited trade agreement, and made no mention whatsoever of any formal alliance, any seat in the new imperial structure, or any acknowledgement of what the humans had done during the war. The political reasoning, as best as I can reconstruct it, was this: the new empire needed to consolidate power among the existing member species. Bringing in a new species, particularly one that had demonstrated the ability to think about warfare in uncomfortable ways, a species that had a documented habit of refusing orders in favor of doing what they thought was right, was seen as a complication. They were, in the calculations of the new imperial architects, inconvenient. So they were erased, not physically. The humans themselves weren't harmed, as far as I can find in the record. They were simply not included. Their coalition was offered a peripheral trade status, non-member, non-voting, non-participating, a polite way of being told to go away. And the history was cleaned. The Veth defensive doctrine remained, but its origins were buried. The battles were recorded as Confederation victories with unnamed Allied support. The name Ilara Vos appears once in the standard imperial history, in a footnote, as a human officer of peripheral involvement. Peripheral involvement. I read that phrase and I had to put the document down and go stand by the window for a while. Now, here's where we get to the part that made this a crisis instead of just a historical injustice. Because the humans, when they were told they weren't welcome in the new empire, didn't argue, they didn't fight, they went home. And then, quietly, over 6 centuries, they built. That's what 600 years of being left alone will do for a species that is apparently constitutionally incapable of sitting still. They expanded. They colonized. They developed technologies in directions that the empire, with its established industries and its stable political structures, and its very reasonable disinclination to take unnecessary risks, hadn't gone. The empire knew, in a vague way, that the humans were out there. The trade agreement was still technically in effect, though actual trade had dwindled to almost nothing. Occasional reports came in from ships at the outer fringe about encountering human vessels. They were noted in the records and largely ignored. And then, 600 years after the end of the Dravathi War, something came through the outer fringe that made the ignoring stop. They were called the Vrethna. I don't know who named them first. The name appears in several outer fringe reports almost simultaneously, which suggests it was a term that spread quickly because it needed to exist quickly. The Vrethna were not a species in any sense that the Empire's existing taxonomy recognized. They were, as far as anyone could determine, something closer to a distributed organism, a vast biological network that existed partially in physical space, and partially in something that the Imperial Science Division still, by the time I found that file cluster, couldn't fully categorize. They didn't communicate in any detectable way. They didn't appear to have political structures or leadership hierarchies, or anything that could be negotiated with. They consumed, that was the word used in the early reports, consumed. Star systems with everything in them. The mechanism wasn't entirely understood, but the result was consistent. A Vrethna incursion entered a system, and within months the system was gone. 15 systems in 18 months. The Empire's outer military had engaged twice, with results that the internal security classification had bumped immediately to the highest restricted level. I found those reports in the sealed archive, too. They were not encouraging. The Empire's weapons worked in the sense that they damaged the Vrethna organisms, but the scale was the problem. The Vrethna weren't one thing that you could destroy. They were an enormous distributed network, and damaging part of it seemed to have approximately the same strategic impact as damaging a single wave in an ocean. The Empire's strategic division produced models. The models all agreed on one thing: At the current rate of advance, the Vrethna incursion would reach the inner systems in approximately 11 years. 11 years to find a solution to something that the most powerful political structure in the known inner sectors had no framework for stopping. And that was the moment that the emergency session of the Imperial Senate, after 3 days of closed-door deliberations, voted to authorize something that had not been done in 600 years. Formal contact with the human coalition. I was in my small office when the news came through. Not because I was important enough to receive classified briefings. I wasn't, not officially, but because word had gotten out in the way that word always gets out in a bureaucracy. Through fragments of conversation and confused looks, and someone leaving a document on a shared terminal that they probably shouldn't have. My supervisor called me into her office. Her name was Director Venkala Thas, and she had been running the Bureau of Historical Continuity for 20 years with an air of extremely controlled competence that I had always found slightly intimidating. She looked, when I sat down across from her, like she hadn't slept. "I know you've been working in the XH7 cluster," she said without preamble. "Yes," I said. "For about 8 months. I know what's in there." I waited. "The Senate authorized contact with the Human Coalition this morning," she said. "The diplomatic team is being assembled. They need a historical liaison, someone who understands the file cluster, someone who can brief the team on context before first contact." I was not, I want to be clear, the obvious choice for this. I was a document archivist. I had not in 32 cycles left Station Kethamara for anything more urgent than a research trip to the Central Library on Veth Prime. I was not a diplomat. I was not a strategist. I was a person who read very old files and wrote reports that other people mostly didn't read. But I had spent 8 months in that file cluster, and I apparently knew more about humanity than anyone else currently available, which was a statement that said a great deal about how thoroughly the erasure had worked. "When do we leave?" I said. The journey to the outer fringe took 11 days. I spent most of it reading. There was still so much in the file cluster that I hadn't gotten through, and I had been given access to a portable terminal with a copy of the full archive. I read about the early contact period, the war, the treaty negotiations, the erasure. I read the personal logs of Oranthes, who had gone on to become a mid-level diplomat and had apparently carried his fascination with humans for the rest of his career, filing reports about them that nobody else in his department seemed particularly interested in. I read about what the humans had looked like, how they had moved, how they had talked. The descriptions were often confused, written by observers who were trying to apply Vethkari cultural frameworks to something that didn't quite fit those frameworks. One phrase kept coming up. Different observers, different contexts, different languages in some cases, but always the same essential observation. They didn't stop. Not in a simple physical sense. In some more fundamental sense that the writers kept struggling to articulate. When things went wrong, humans recalculated and continued. When they were hurt, they tended their injuries and continued. When they were afraid, and there were clear records of humans being afraid, physiological responses that were well documented and undeniable, they continued anyway. There was a psychological term that appeared in some of the early xenobiology reports. I had to look it up because it wasn't a term used in Vethkari primary languages. The humans called it in their own language, stubbornness, or sometimes persistence, or sometimes in certain contexts that seemed to carry more weight, hope. One of the xenobiologists had written a rather beautiful analysis of this trait. I read it 4 times on the journey, in which she argued that the human psychological profile was built around a fundamental assumption that was, from a purely logical standpoint, unwarranted. The assumption that things could improve. That even in situations where the available data suggested a negative outcome, the humans maintained what she called counterfactual optimism. The belief that the situation could be different. That effort could change outcomes that appeared determined. She wrote, "This is not in the strict sense rational, but it may be the most important psychological attribute I have ever documented in any sapient species, because it appears to generate behaviors that, in aggregate, actually do change outcomes. The humans are not right to believe that things will improve, but they act as though they are right, and in acting that way, they make it more likely that they are right. I'm not sure whether to classify this as a cognitive bias or a survival adaptation or something else entirely. Possibly all 3. I thought about that analysis for a long time, watching the stars move past the ship's observation windows. I thought, no wonder they erased you. You make the rest of us feel the absence of something we can't quite name. We came out of the transit corridor into the outer fringe, at a point that the navigation charts labeled simply as boundary. It was a real designation, the navigator told me, the boundary between Imperial mapped space and the regions beyond. The regions beyond. That was where the humans were. That was where they had been building for 600 years. The first sign of them was not what I expected. I had been imagining something that looked like the early ships in the archive records, functional, mid-sized, utilitarian. What came out of the sensor array was something that made every person on the bridge go quiet. It was a fleet. Not a patrol fleet, not a border guard. A fleet. 147 ships according to the sensor count. Ranging in size from small, fast-moving vessels that were making complex intercept patterns around the larger ships to three-somethings, that were so large my mind initially refused to process them as ships at all. They were more like moving structures, station-sized, carrying weapons that my sensor analyst described in a voice that was very carefully neutral as outside our current reference database. And at the front of the fleet, slightly ahead of the rest, one ship moving forward to meet us. The communication request came through in standard Imperial frequency, which surprised me. The translation was clean, slightly accented in a way I couldn't identify, but completely clear. Imperial vessel, this is the CSNS Endurance. We've been tracking your approach for 6 hours. We appreciate you coming all the way out here. We thought you might eventually. The diplomat who was nominally leading our mission, a very composed Vethkari named Ambassador Selathrenk, looked at me with what I can only describe as a question she didn't know how to form. I leaned forward toward the communication console. CSNS Endurance, I said. This is Archivist Velsoren Toth, Historical Liaison. We've come to open a dialogue on behalf of the Imperial Senate. A pause, short but noticeable. Then an archivist, that's interesting. What did you find? The captain of the CSNS Endurance was a human named Commander J. Arrays. She was, and I am still figuring out how to describe this in a way that makes sense across a significant cultural gap, medium-sized. By human standards, apparently, she was average. By almost any other species' standards, she was entirely unremarkable in physical terms. She had dark skin and gray at her temples and very dark eyes that did the thing I had read about in the xenobiology reports. The direct, sustained eye contact that other species' first contact protocols always categorized as potentially aggressive, but that was, in humans, apparently just how they looked at you when they were paying attention. She was paying attention. She met our diplomatic delegation in a conference room on the Endurance that was clearly designed for this purpose. Large table, neutral colors, seating that accommodated multiple body configurations. They had prepared. They had been preparing, I suspected, for longer than they had let on. We went through the formal greetings, the diplomatic language. Ambassador Selathrenk delivered the opening statement. Commander Reyes listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question. How many systems have you lost so far? Selathrenk hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, but Reyes noticed it. I could tell she noticed it. 15 confirmed, the ambassador said. We count 16, Reyes said quietly. The 16th wasn't in your territory, it was adjacent to ours. We've been watching it for 2 months. The room was very still. You've been watching the Vrethna? Selathrenk said. We've been watching them for 1.5 years, Reyes said. Since the first incursion reports reached us. She folded her hands on the table. I want to be very clear about something before we go any further, Ambassador. We're not here to negotiate aid in the traditional sense. We're not going to offer you assistance in exchange for political recognition or trade rights or a seat at whatever table you currently have. We're here because there's something out there that, if we don't stop it, is going to consume everything, including us. And that's not something we can allow to happen. She looked around the table, meeting each set of eyes in turn. We've had 600 years, she said. We built some things that might be relevant. We're prepared to show you what we have. But I want to make sure you understand why we're doing it. Why are you doing it? I said. I don't think I was supposed to speak. I was the archivist, not the diplomat. but the question came out before I had fully processed that I was asking it. Reyes looked at me. "Because that's what you do," she said simply, "when something needs doing." The briefing took 3 days. I won't say I understood everything they showed us. Some of what the human engineers and scientists presented was beyond my technical training to fully follow. But I understood the shape of it, and the shape of it was, frankly, staggering. They had not spent 600 years in the same lines of development as the Empire. The Empire had excellent ships, excellent weapons, a well-established understanding of physics and chemistry and biology, and the other disciplines that formed the foundation of technological civilization. It had been doing those things for a long time, and it had gotten very good at them. The humans had done something different. They had been thinking, apparently, about threats. Not just the threats they knew about, the threats they could imagine. The Vrethna weren't the first large-scale existential category they had modeled for. Humans, it turned out, had a long and extremely well-developed tradition of what they called worst-case planning, the practice of imagining the most catastrophic possible situation, and then figuring out in advance what you would do about it. The Empire, with its successful 4,000-year history, had somewhat less practice with this. You don't spend a lot of time planning for extinction-level events when your civilization is doing fine. The humans had never felt safe enough to stop planning. And in that consistent, low-grade awareness of possible catastrophe, they had developed technologies that the Empire had never had reason to develop. The most important one had no good translation in standard imperial language. The humans called it resonance disruption. The basic principle, as it was explained to me by a human engineer named Tors who had approximately 3 times more patience than I deserved, was this. The Vrethna existed partially in a frequency of spacetime that standard matter didn't typically interact with. Standard weapons worked on the physical portion of the organisms, which was why they did damage but not decisive damage. You were hitting part of something, not all of it. Resonance disruption worked on the frequency layer. It disrupted the distributed coherence of the network, not by destroying individual parts of it, but by interfering with the signal that held the parts together. Like static, Tors said, and then realized that wasn't a term I'd recognize and spent 10 minutes finding an analogy that worked. Like disconnecting the nerves of an organism was what she eventually said, not killing each cell individually, severing the connections. The technology was not small. It required ships. It required coordination. It required the kind of logistical operation that the Empire's military was, actually, well-suited to support. Humans plus imperial logistics infrastructure. That was the plan. I want to tell you about the moment I understood, fully, what was happening. It was on the 2nd day of the briefing. We'd been going through technical data all morning, and there was a break in the proceedings. The humans served food, which was one of the things they did that was different from most imperial species meeting protocols. And I was standing near the window eating something I couldn't identify but which was surprisingly good, watching the stars. Commander Reyes came to stand next to me. She didn't say anything for a moment. We both just looked at the stars. "You found the XH7 cluster," she said finally. "Yes. Orinthes's logs." I turned to look at her. "You know those records?" "We have copies," she said. "We've always had copies. We kept our own records." A small pause. "We knew you'd sealed ours eventually. We made sure we had backups." I didn't know what to say to that. "The history," I started. "You don't need to apologize," she said. "We're not here for an apology." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "My great-great-grandmother was in the fleet during the Drevathi War, a navigator. She died at the Veth 4 relay point." I was very still. "We remember," Reyes said. "All of us, it's in our histories, our schools, our family records. We know what happened." She turned to look at me. "And we're still here. We still came when we were needed, because that's the thing about us archivists. We remember and we come anyway." She walked back to the table. I stayed at the window for a while longer. I was thinking about the word that the xenobiologist had used, hope. The unwarranted, counterfactual, irrational, world-changing assumption that things can be different. I think I understood it then, standing at that window, in a way that reading about it had not quite managed to convey. The formal agreement was signed on the 4th day. It wasn't a long document. I had been involved in enough imperial administrative work to know that most formal agreements ran to thousands of clauses and subclauses and interpretive frameworks, and I had expected something similar. The human draft was 11 pages. Selethrink stared at it for a long time. "Is this complete?" she said. "We find shorter agreements are more likely to be honored," Reyes said. The core of it was simple. Joint military operation against the Vrethna, human technology combined with imperial infrastructure, shared command structure. And this was the part that took the most negotiation. This was what the 3 days of talking had actually been about, a full accounting of the historical record. An acknowledgement by the Empire of what had happened 600 years ago. The diplomatic language around that third point was very careful. It said, "The Imperial Senate agrees to commission a comprehensive review of historical records pertaining to the human imperial engagement during the period designated the Veth Consolidation War, with the purpose of establishing an accurate and complete public historical account." Which was a very long and cautious way of saying, "We will tell the truth about what happened." Reyes had insisted on it. Not as a condition of military cooperation, she had been very clear that the military cooperation was happening regardless, but as something separate, something that needed to be right for its own sake. I had been the one who drafted the language on that clause. It was the most important thing I did in my career. I know that. The operation against the Vrethna took 7 months. I was not there for most of it, in any direct sense. I was back at Kethamara, coordinating the historical documentation work that the agreement required, working with a team of archivists from 3 species to reconstruct the accurate record of the Veth Consolidation War and the human contribution to it. But I followed the military dispatches. I read every report that came through. The resonance disruption technology worked. It worked the way the human engineers had said it would, which was a thing I had quietly been holding my breath about, even though I had not said so aloud. The combined fleet operated in ways I had never seen in any military record. The humans and the Imperial forces developing over those 7 months, a kind of coordination that surprised even the participating commanders. There were difficult moments. There were losses. The Vrethna didn't stop simply because their distributed coherence was being disrupted. The process was gradual, required sustained pressure. And during that sustained pressure, the Vrethna hit back in ways that cost lives on both sides. One of the dispatches, from the human fleet's coordinating officer, described a moment during the 3rd major engagement when an Imperial cruiser took catastrophic damage and was unable to maintain its position in the disruption formation. The human ship that was adjacent to it, a smaller, faster vessel called the Constancy, immediately moved to cover the gap, taking on more than its recommended share of the counterpressure, holding the line until the damaged Imperial cruiser could withdraw. The Constancy took serious damage in doing that. The dispatch noted, in what I recognized as a deliberate and careful piece of understatement, that the Constancy's crew had been briefed on the risks and had proceeded voluntarily. I read that and thought about Commander Voss, 600 years earlier, writing to Fleet Admiral Kesharova. "I am not reporting this because I want recognition. I am reporting it because I thought you should know that the decision was theirs, not mine." Some things apparently don't change. The Vrethna incursion ended, was stopped, was dismantled network by network over 7 months of sustained, combined operation, in what the Joint Command named the Boundary Action. The name was deliberate. The humans suggested it, not the battle of this, not the defense of that. The Boundary Action, named for the place where the 2 civilizations had first met across a table and decided to trust each other enough to try. I thought that was right. I thought that was exactly right. There's an end to this story, though I'm not sure I know exactly where to put it. The historical accounting project took 2 years. It was the most complicated archival work I had ever been involved in, and I was working with the best team I had ever worked with, which helped. The public release of the revised history, the Veth Consolidation War, the human contribution, the political decisions that had led to the erasure, caused exactly the reaction that the officials who had buried it 600 years ago had been trying to prevent. People were upset, a lot of people, the kind of upset that requires public statements from very senior officials and extended deliberative sessions in the Senate. But there was something else, too. Something that the officials who had buried the history had perhaps not accounted for, because it was the kind of thing that's hard to model. People were also moved by the story itself, by what humans had done and why. By the detail in those old documents, the Reliant staying in position when ordered to retreat, the message about the crew's unanimous decision, the xenobiologists' analysis of hope. The human coalition sent representatives to the Imperial Senate, for the first time, in what was agreed by everyone involved to be an overdue beginning. I attended the first formal session in which a human representative addressed the Senate chamber. Her name was Delegate Mora Chen. She was older than Ray's, quieter in her manner, and she had spent her career in human diplomatic circles. She was very good at the formal language. But at the end of her opening address, which was excellent, technically precise, appropriately diplomatic, she set down her prepared text and looked at the assembled chamber. "We've been gone a long time," she said, "and we know why, we know what happened, and we've known for a long time. I'm not going to dwell on it because dwelling isn't particularly useful." A small pause. "What I will say is this. We came back when we were needed. We would have come back sooner if we'd been asked, and we will be here going forward for as long as the need exists." Another pause. "That's who we are. That's always been who we are." The chamber was quiet. Then the applause began. I retired from the Bureau of Historical Continuity 6 months after the public history was released. I'd been thinking about it for a while, and the timing felt right. The work I had set out to do, the work that had actually mattered, was done. I took a position with the new joint Human Imperial Historical Foundation, which was doing the long-term work of integrating the two histories into something coherent. It was good work. Complicated work in the way that honest work usually is. But the moment I think about most, when I think about all of it, is not any of the grand events. Not the Senate session, not the signing of the agreement, not the final dispatch announcing the end of the boundary action. It's Commander J. Arrays, standing at that window watching the stars. We remember and we come anyway. 600 years of being erased. Of being reduced to a metaphor for fiction, human tale, meaning something that was obviously invented, probably emotionally manipulative and almost certainly wrong. And they came anyway. Not because the Empire deserved it. Not because the accounting had been settled, because it hadn't. Not because everything was forgiven, because forgiveness is a slower process than a single crisis can provide. They came because something needed doing. I spent 32 years filing documents in a small office and believing in some vague and unexamined way that history was a record of things that had already been decided. Fixed points, finished stories. I don't believe that anymore. History is an argument that's still in progress. And some of the most important arguments are made not with words, but with the decision to show up anyway, in the held breath moment right before everything changes, and do the thing that needs doing. That's what humans are. That's what they have always been. Not a myth. A reminder.